Last week, you might remember, we spoke to Lorenzo Sua, a New Zealander who's being held in an Australian detention centre. When we spoke to him, he was in the Villawood detention centre in Sydney, where we just heard they're on hunger strike. He'd already spent 4 months there while he waits to find out if he'll be deported for actual bodily harm, which was his first offence. But after that interview, Mr Sua says things changed.
So my interview was aired on a Monday. That was all fine. And then the following day, Tuesday, 3 o'clock in the morning, I had officers. There was 8 officers that walked in my room, woke me up, and pretty much told me I had to go see immigration at the front office. 3 o'clock in the morning. They said, "Don't touch any of your stuff. Just come with us." And then they escorted me up to the front, where I was told that I was being transferred to another detention centre.
Mr Sua is now being held at a detention centre outside Perth. He says his Sydney-based family is devastated.
They hit the panic button. They were calling everyone to see where I was at. Nobody was saying anything, and yeah, they were just absolutely devastated to find out that I'd been moved. Obviously, I've got no family here, and being so far away from home. The worst thing about it was that my birthday was at the end of this month, and I'd organised my kids to come up and see me for my birthday because I was unable to see them over Christmas. And yeah, that's been taken away from me too.
Mr Sua says it's financially impossible for his family to come to Perth to visit him. He has been able to speak to them on the phone, but he hasn't been able to offer them any certainty about his situation. Now, to talk about this and a few other things, we're joined in the Auckland studio by the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. Good morning and Happy New Year to you.
Good morning and Happy New Year to you.
What do you think about this situation? It's certainly not getting any better, is it?
Yeah, well, obviously we've got the two issues here of those who are being detained and also deportations. We tend to get information from Australian officials at the time that people are being deported, so certainly tracking what's happening there. We've raised concerns, obviously, in the past about elements of both policies. Ultimately, though, Australia certainly, as New Zealand, is free to design its own immigration rules and deportation rules. This is something that is their prerogative regardless of our views.
And have you spoken to Malcolm Turnbull about it? You promised that you would make those representations. What's been done so far, given that this situation isn't getting any better?
Yeah, certainly when it comes to issues of citizenship, the deportations, particularly those cases where we have seen those who have been deported to New Zealand who have almost no links to New Zealand other than their citizenship or certainly have spent a majority of their life elsewhere. On those cases, we certainly made representation. We have seen some changes, although you will still see some headlines that indicate it is, of course, there are cases that are still happening. But we did see some alterations to the way the appeals process seems to be working in those cases. But we continue to raise this issues alongside others, as you'd expect in a robust relationship like ours.
And speaking to Andrew Little last week, I was surprised that he said, look, nothing more really can be done for the families. I mean, they're the ones who are suffering from this. It's obviously not a great idea for people to be apart from their families. They're the ones being punished, and the detainee themselves, they've served their time, they've served their sentence, they're being held against their will indefinitely.
Oh, and look, Andrew Little is certainly right.
So nothing can be done for the families?
Well, for us it's a matter of advocacy because this is still within Australia's jurisdiction. And we ourselves also have a policy of deportation. We tend to operate it in our way, and Australia operates it in theirs. It doesn't stop us, of course, from making the point as we have, of course, in the past. Kelvin Davis, in particular, a huge advocate in this area, and we continue to do so. But Andrew is absolutely right when he says we are limited in what we're able to do.
See, the government has its advocates there. How frustrating is it, though, because of all the talk in the past about this issue, just not to be able to get any movement there from Australia?
Same with a number of issues with any number of countries, that we use our diplomatic channels, we use our relationship, but beyond that, it ultimately sits outside of our jurisdiction.
Okay, I want to talk about the abuse, the state abuse inquiry. You might have heard that we've had lots of voices recently, including people that worked in the Royal Commission in Australia, calling for the government to broaden the scope of the inquiry. We're chasing Tracy Martin last week. Yesterday I spoke to a abuse victim, and we're working through some of the legal channels there to see whether we can air that interview later this week. First time you've spoken out. And all of them are calling for the government, for you, to broaden the inquiry so that it includes faith-based institutions, sports clubs. I mean, the Royal Commission in Australia was extraordinarily broad. Will you commit to doing that? Yeah,
it was extraordinarily broad. But, I have to say, in the number of years that I've worked across this area, there has also been a huge and compelling case made around anywhere where the state has had some role to play in the ultimate circumstances and situation of abuse that an individual has found themselves in. Now, that's whether or not a child may have been in state care and then was placed in a particular environment, or had anything to do with the decision-making that led to that young person in particular being abused. So the state's reach in that respect goes beyond sometimes state institutions. The question then again has, of course, arisen, particularly following Australia, as to whether or not it should go beyond that again. Certainly, the primary call I've always heard has been the state and the state's responsibility. And I personally believe that as the state, we need to hold responsibility. We need to open ourselves up to inquiring into the harm that we had direct responsibility for. We haven't even done that yet. I absolutely understand that there are another group who equally have experienced huge suffering, abuse and victimisation beyond the state, but this for us is about establishing the role that the state played, that we played ultimately in that harm.
What about the claims, though, that this is a one chance to include them all, that victims will feel excluded once again if they're left out of this? Many victims talking, and they've been abused in all sorts of situations. The success, really, of the Royal Commission in Australia is such a precedent. These things are costly as well. If you set up one and then you've got to then do one for every other institution, isn't it better? I mean, all the institutions are looked at separately in the model that Australia had. Why not lump them all in together?
So I think a big driver for why we were doing this as well was we were going through a period of reform with the way that the state was making decisions around the care of children and young people. Oranga Tamariki was established, and there was this conversation that was had that said, have we actually learnt from the past as a state? The confidential listening and assistance service had been established under a previous Labor government that undertook a process almost of listening and reconciliation, but it wasn't open. It wasn't public. There wasn't the release of those outcomes for everyone to see. And I think it left victims feeling like we hadn't really learnt any lessons. So the trigger really for us is, if we are going to try and redesign the system, genuinely make sure we're doing things differently, what have we done to establish that we're not repeating the mistakes of the past? Those are key learnings for the state. I would call on any religious institution who is hearing these kinds of cries, who is hearing this, to take a similar approach and saying, well, what have we done to demonstrate we've learned from the past?
But the whole learning from Australia is that these organisations need to be under a royal commission.
Look, and I'm certainly not saying that anyone would expect them to inquire into themselves and do it in a way that a victim would find satisfactory. Certainly not. But what I am saying is that as a starting point for the state, we have to, if we're ever going to learn from the mistakes, be open about those that are being made, and we haven't done that yet.
Your message to victims that this state abuse inquiry won't address?
Yeah, what I will say is that we have heard that we certainly, I know they don't want us as politicians to sit, draft terms of reference and conclude that that's the way it will be established and done. So we've already decided that, yes, we might put out a starting point, but an independent chair will then go and consult on those. And so that's the way we're going to make sure that we include the voices of many. But certainly I know people will have heard that for me, the great burden of responsibility in coming into this is what we do when it comes to the state.
Okay. 100 days is coming up. Everyone's getting back to work. What's your calculation on the date? We've got 3rd of Feb. Is that
That's correct.
Got? Right. So you've done fairly well on that checklist. You've got a couple more things to do though. What's first on the list?
Yes, obviously the inquiry into abuse. That's one that we need to get the wheels in motion of. I will assure people though that that's not the completion for that one is kicking it off. So we will be consulting beyond the 3rd of Feb around those draft terms of reference. Also the mental health inquiry introducing employment legislation, and my child poverty bill will be introduced into Parliament. And
Great.
then that should complete the list.
And the Cabinet meeting is it Monday?
We've got one coming up next Tuesday.
Right.
And then one again following Monday, and we're back into it.
One idea for you. How about taking a leaf out of Donald Trump's book and inviting the media into the Cabinet meeting?
I don't think I've ever heard the beginning of that sentence put to me. A leaf out of Donald Trump's book. So for the entire Cabinet meeting?
Did you watch it? It was interesting. It was on CNN.
Yes,
It was very
I imagine
open.
it was reasonably sanitised for those purposes.
They also had a cross-party discussion on the wall and the delays with the wall, and I was thinking a cross-party discussion is just like what your cabinet might be like.
Well, I mean, certainly it's very open exchange of ideas, and I don't imagine a discussion on the wall was at all staged for the media, not for a moment.
Thank you so much for your time this
Thank
morning. That's
you.
the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern getting back to work as the year gets underway. It's coming up to 28 minutes past 8. A look at the international websites. Oh, well, the front pages first. The New Zealand Herald leads with a story about a long-serving volunteer lifeguard who's speaking out about the abuse he cops from beachgoers. The Waikato Times profiles a forensic crime scene cleaner and what he does day to day. The Dominion Post has a headline, Hot Days and Sleepless Nights as Wellingtonians struggle to cope with